dealing with the async API from the server is also easy. We basically need to use Axios here as well. So we'll import Axios from Axios, and we'll do the Axios call here. However, before we do that, we need to make this app component server-side render friendly. Right now it's not. Let's take a look at the app component. So the app component starts with empty values for both articles and authors, and then asynchronously load the data with component didMount. So to make this app component server-side render friendly, we need to have it understand initial data. So the server-side code needs to render the app component with some initial data. So let's actually call it initial data. And in here, we're going to pass some variable coming from the Axios fetch call. This means that the app component needs to start understanding this initial data prop. So for example, the initial articles will come from this.props.initialData.articles. And similarly, the initial authors will come from this.props.initialData.authors. So now if we pass an initial data to the app component, it will render correctly. But what we just did actually broke the client side, because the client side starts with empty props here. If we go to the client renderer, the DOM.js, it renders the app without any props. So to make this code work both ways, we also need to pass an initial data structure here. We can simply just pass an empty initial data object here. So let's do initial data. And in here, we'll do articles is an empty object and authors is an empty object as well. This is the same initial data that I just removed from the state. And we'll pass this initial data in here. So with this change in the DOM renderer, the application will again render correctly on the client side. But now I have a way for the server side to also specify the initial data here as well. So the initial data in this case will come from the Axios fetch call, which is actually exactly the same thing we did here. So we need the Axios call, we need the data API. So we'll import that from state API. Note that I didn't need to change any paths, right? It's all absolute under lib. And I'm using await here, which means I need to label the server render as async as well. So now my initial data is this exact object, but on the server side. So let's do that. The initial data here is exactly the same object that I used on the state. And I just pass initial data. So with this change, both the server and the client will render the exact same thing. However, since we made the server render async, we now have to deal with this asynchronous function when we render the content as well. So inside server.js, the actual file where we're actually using server render is now an async call, which means I can await on it and just label the function as async as well. Before we can test, this Axios call worked for us on the client because this /data was a relative URL on the client. On the server, we don't have that option. So instead of data, let's do a variable here. And this will need to be HTTP host and port and then /data. And we can read the host and port because they are configurable. We'll just read them from the configuration directly. Let's take a look at configuration. We only have port actually in configuration. Let's add host. So we'll try to read that from the environment if it exists. If it doesn't, we'll just use localhost. And then back to the renderer. So we'll import config. Instead of host and port, we'll do config.host and config.port. Let's make sure the server is happy, and it is. Let's test. Perfect. We're seeing the content with JavaScript disabled. Very cool. Now, what happens when we enable JavaScript? Well, the application will just render. It will render server side and then it will render client side, but you'll notice that React is going to give you a warning. Now, this warning is important. So let me demonstrate why React is giving me a warning here. To do so, I'm going to the app component and let's put a debugger statement right here in the render call. Here's the first stop of the debugger line. As you can see, the browser has a copy of the HTML, and that's because we rendered it server side. However, at this point, my state has empty articles objects and empty author objects because the DOM renderer is trying to do exactly that, render the app component with empty articles object and empty authors object. So in the second stop here, React has rendered my app component without any data. And then after this render call, when the empty app component is mounted, the code that we have in component did mount will fetch the data again and render it back in the browser. So this is actually wasteful on so many ways. First, we are fetching the exact same data twice. And second, we're throwing away a good DOM and replacing it with the exact same DOM. So that's wasteful. React should continue to do nothing in that case. So take a moment now and think about how we can solve this problem.